"You're too weak, old man. Get out of there before you get hurt." The supervisor's tone echoed through the factory, followed by muffled laughter among the workers. The metallic sound of the toolbox opening contrasted with the arrogance in the air. The stooped man walked towards the stalled machine like someone facing a giant. The silence from the others was one of contempt, not respect, but his eyes, fixed on the gears, revealed something that no one there dared to imagine. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're watching from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The metallic groan of dying machinery echoed through the cavernous halls of Riverside Manufacturing like a funeral dirge, each stuttering breath of the main production line marking another minute of catastrophic downtime. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across oil-stained concrete floors where puddles reflected the frantic movements of supervisors whose voices grew sharper with each passing moment. The air hung thick with the acrid smell of overheated metal and burning rubber, punctuated by the nervous coughing of workers who stood clustered in small groups, afraid to move without orders, afraid to stay idle too long. Plant manager Rick Morrison paced behind the massive German-engineered assembly unit that had cost the company $2 million just 18 months ago. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the floor with military precision, but his usually confident demeanor had cracked like cheap paint under pressure. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the November chill seeping through the factory's high windows, and his expensive suit jacket hung open, revealing a silk tie loosened in defeat. 47 minutes, Morrison barked into his phone, his voice carrying across the production floor. "Every minute costs us $8,000. Where's the tech support team from Hamburg?" He listened for a moment, his face darkening. "What do you mean they can't get here until tomorrow morning?" Maintenance supervisor Janet Powell approached with a tablet in her hands, her steel-toed boots making no sound on the concrete. 20 years younger than Morrison and twice as smart, she'd climbed through the ranks on merit alone, earning respect in a world that didn't give it freely to women. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and grease stains marked her company-issued coveralls like badges of honor. "Rick, the diagnostic system shows critical failure in the primary hydraulic coupling," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "We've tried everything in the manual. The backup protocols aren't responding either." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Get me someone who can think outside that damn manual. We've got 3 shifts backing up, the corporate office breathing down my neck, and a delivery deadline that's about to destroy our biggest contract." The sound of footsteps approached from the employee entrance, slow and measured against the frenetic energy surrounding the disabled machine. Workers turned to look, their expressions shifting from curiosity to barely concealed derision as they saw who was walking toward them. Walter Kowalski moved with the careful gait of a man whose 73-year-old bones carried the weight of 5 decades in heavy industry. His weathered face bore the permanent lines of someone who had squinted through countless years of metal dust and welding sparks, and his hands, though steady, showed the countless small scars that came from a lifetime of working with unforgiving machinery. He wore faded blue coveralls that had seen better decades, and in his grip was a battered red toolbox that looked like it had survived both world wars and several factory closures. "Jesus Christ," muttered Tommy Castellano, a 30-something operator whose muscled arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of his weekend motorcycle rides. "Look what the cat dragged in." Walter had been the plant's head mechanic for 28 years before the company's restructuring had forced him into early retirement 3 years ago. The young efficiency experts from corporate had deemed his methods outdated, his pace too slow for modern production demands. They'd replaced him with computerized diagnostic systems and fresh-faced engineering graduates who spoke in acronyms and carried tablets instead of wrenches. Lisa Chun, one of those graduates, looked up from her laptop where error codes scrolled in endless red text. Her pristine lab coat and safety glasses marked her as management track, someone who understood theory but had never felt the vibration of a bearing about to fail, or heard the subtle change in pitch that warned of impending catastrophe. "Mr. Morrison," she said, not bothering to hide her impatience. "We need specialized technicians, not ... She gestured dismissively toward Walter, letting the unfinished sentence hang in the air like toxic fumes. Walter stopped 10 feet from the silent machine, setting his toolbox down with the same reverence a priest might show placing a Bible on an altar. The sound of metal against concrete carried further than it should have in the noisy factory, causing conversations to pause as workers turned to stare. Some faces showed amusement, others irritation, but most displayed the kind of casual cruelty that comes when people need someone to blame for their frustration. "Who called you?" Morrison demanded, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of ventilation systems and distant machinery still running. In other parts of the plant, Walter's pale blue eyes met Morrison's without flinching. "Nobody called me," he said quietly, his voice carrying the flat vowels of his Michigan childhood. "Heard through the neighborhood that you had trouble." Powell stepped forward, her expression softening slightly. Among the supervisors, she alone remembered Walter's reputation. The stories of impossible fixes and machinery coaxed back to life through some combination of experience and intuition that couldn't be taught in engineering school. But even her respect was tempered by 3 years of technological advancement and the pressure to embrace modern methods. "Walter, I appreciate you coming by," she said, her tone carefully diplomatic, "but we're dealing with integrated systems here. Computer-controlled hydraulics, servo motors, programmable logic controllers. It's not like the old stamping presses." A ripple of suppressed laughter moved through the watching crowd. Someone whispered old-timer with the kind of dismissive affection reserved for outdated things that had once been useful. Another voice, younger and sharper, said something about nursing homes that didn't quite carry but drew knowing smirks from several workers. Walter's weathered hands remained steady as he opened his toolbox, the hinges moving with the smooth action of something well-maintained despite its age. Inside, tools lay arranged with military precision, wrenches worn smooth by decades of use, gauges whose faces had been polished by countless readings, and instruments that hadn't been manufactured in 20 years but still measured pressure and tolerance with accuracy that shamed their digital replacements. "That machine's been good to this plant for 18 months, Walter said, his voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the immediate area. "Seems like it deserves a chance to be good for 18 more. Morrison's face flushed red. The plant's workforce was watching. Corporate was breathing down his neck, and every minute of delay moved them closer to disaster. The last thing he needed was some retired relic playing games with equipment that cost more than most people's houses. "This isn't a classic car show, Walter," Morrison said, his voice rising. "We're talking about precision machinery that requires specialized training to service. You've been out of the game for 3 years. Technology moves fast." The dismissal hung in the air like a slap, and for a moment Walter's shoulders seemed to settle under its weight. Around them, workers began to drift away, convinced the entertainment was over before it had really begun. The morning shift would have stories to tell about the old man who thought he could fix 21st century problems with 20th century tools. But Walter didn't pack up his toolbox. Instead, he moved closer to the silent machine, his eyes scanning the massive steel framework with the patience of someone reading a favorite book. His fingers, gnarled but surprisingly gentle, touched the main housing where vibration should have been thrumming through the metal like a heartbeat. "Sometimes," he said so quietly that only Powell caught the words, "the newest thing breaks the same way the oldest thing does." The factory around them continued its chaotic symphony of crisis management. But for just a moment, something in Walter's voice suggested that beneath the surface of this humiliation, something else was stirring. Something that hadn't been broken by 3 years of forced retirement or a lifetime of being underestimated. Something that still remembered how to listen to the language machines spoke when no one else was around to hear. Walter circled the towering machine like a doctor examining a patient, his calloused fingertips trailing along painted steel surfaces that still radiated residual heat from the morning's production. "Run." The assembly unit stood 12 feet tall and stretched nearly 40 feet in length, a monument to German engineering precision that had revolutionized Riverside Manufacturing's output capacity when it arrived with great fanfare and a ribbon-cutting ceremony featuring the mayor. Now it squatted silent and sullen, its LED status panels dark, except for a single red fault indicator that blinked with the persistence of a digital heartbeat flatlined. The smell of hydraulic fluid hung in the air, not the usual clean scent of properly circulating oil, but the acrid tong of fluid that had overheated and begun breaking down under pressure. Morrison's phone buzzed again. His jaw clenched as he read the text message, then shoved the device back into his pocket with enough force to strain the fabric. "Corporate wants a status report in 30 minutes, he announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the brittle edge of a man whose career was balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Walter paused at the machine's control panel, a complex array of touchscreens, indicator lights, and emergency stops that looked like the bridge of a spacecraft compared to the simple mechanical controls he'd worked with for most of his career. But beneath all the digital sophistication, he could see the bones of something familiar. Hydraulic pistons, gear assemblies, and bearing housings that functioned according to the same physical laws that had governed machinery since the Industrial Revolution. The diagnostic says hydraulic system failure, Powell said, approaching with a printout in her hands. Despite her earlier diplomatic dismissal, something in her voice suggested she was genuinely curious about Walter's assessment. We've checked fluid levels, filter condition, pump operation. Everything tests normal. But the system won't build pressure. Walter accepted the diagnostic report, holding the paper at arm's length as his eyes adjusted to the small print. His reading glasses had been lost somewhere in the transition from active employment to retirement. Another small indignity in a series that had seemed endless 3 years ago. Pressure relief valve? He asked, his finger tracing down the technical specifications. First thing we checked, replied Lisa Chun, her voice carrying a note of professional irritation. The valve's operating within normal parameters. We've run 3 complete diagnostic cycles. Around them, the morning shift was settling into the uncomfortable rhythm of unexpected downtime. Some workers huddled in small groups, their conversations punctuated by nervous laughter and speculation about how long the stoppage might last. Others had found tasks to occupy themselves, cleaning workstations that were already clean, reorganizing tool cribs that were already organized, anything to avoid the appearance of idleness under management's watchful eyes. Walter set his toolbox on a nearby workbench, the metal surface scarred by decades of abuse from impact wrenches and cutting torches. As he lifted the lid, the organized interior revealed itself like a surgeon's instrument tray, each tool in its designated place. Every item bearing the patina of constant use, but maintained with the obsessive care of someone who understood that precision instruments were the difference between success and failure. He selected a stethoscope-like device that looked older than some of the workers watching him, its brass fittings green with age but polished to a dull shine. The younger technicians exchanged glances that mixed amusement with disbelief. In an age of computer diagnostics and digital sensors, Walter's mechanical stethoscope seemed as anachronistic as a slide rule in a computer lab. "You've got to be kidding me," muttered Tommy Castellano, loud enough to be heard but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability if challenged. "My grandfather used one of those things." Walter ignored the comment, pressing the listening device against various points along the hydraulic system's main housing. His eyes closed as he concentrated, head tilted slightly like a musician tuning an instrument. The factory's ambient noise faded into background static as he focused on the mechanical whispers that normal ears couldn't detect. Morrison watched with growing impatience, his expensive watch marking each second that slipped away like money bleeding from the company's accounts. "Walter, I appreciate whatever this is you're doing, but we need real solutions. The Hamburg technicians will be here tomorrow morning with the proper diagnostic equipment. Tomorrow morning we'll have lost 2 full production days," Walter replied without opening his eyes or moving the stethoscope. "That's about $400,000 in missed deliveries, plus overtime costs to make up the backlog." The precision of Walter's calculations surprised Morrison, who hadn't expected the old mechanic to understand the financial implications of downtime. For a moment, the plant manager's irritation flickered with something that might have been respect, but it passed quickly as another text message demanded his attention. Walter moved to a different section of the machine, his stethoscope pressed against a junction where multiple hydraulic lines converged into a central manifold. This time his eyes opened, and Powell noticed a subtle change in his expression, not quite satisfaction, but the kind of focused attention that suggested he'd found something worth investigating. "There," Walter said quietly, tapping the manifold housing with one finger. "You hear that?" Powell leaned closer, straining to detect whatever Walter claimed to have discovered, but the cacophony of factory noise made it impossible to distinguish individual sounds. "Hear what?" "The cavity resonance is off," Walter explained, moving the stethoscope to allow Powell to listen. "Should have a solid thunk when you tap it. Instead, it's got a hollow ring like tapping a bell." Chun stepped forward, her expression skeptical but curious. "Cavity resonance isn't a standard diagnostic parameter. Our computerized systems would have detected any significant anomaly." Walter's weathered face creased into something that wasn't quite a smile but wasn't entirely serious either. "Ma'am, with respect, your computer knows what it's been programmed to look for. Sometimes problems hide in the spaces between the programming." He returned to his toolbox, this time selecting a wrench that had been forged when Eisenhower was president. The tool's handle showed the wear patterns of countless hands, its chrome plating worn through to bare steel in the places where fingers had gripped it through decades of use, compared to the bright, ergonomically designed tools that hung from the plant's modern service carts. Walter's wrench looked like an artifact from an industrial museum. "You're not seriously planning to start removing components," Morrison said, his voice rising toward panic. "That machine's under warranty. Any unauthorized modifications could void our service contract. Walter paused, the wrench halfway to the manifold's access bolts. Around them, the watching crowd had grown larger as word spread through the plant that the old-timer was actually attempting repairs rather than simply offering unsolicited advice. Some faces showed genuine curiosity, others barely concealed amusement at what they assumed would be an embarrassing failure. "Rick," Walter said, using the plant manager's first name with the casual familiarity of someone who had worked at Riverside when Morrison was still in college. "This machine's been good to you. Made you money, kept your production numbers up, impressed the corporate folks who decided to promote you to plant manager." Morrison's face reddened at the reminder of his relatively recent elevation to the position. Earned more through political maneuvering than shop floor experience. "What's your point?" "My point is that machines, like people, sometimes need someone who's willing to listen to what they're actually trying to say, instead of just what you want to hear." With that, Walter positioned his wrench and applied steady pressure to the first bolt. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if the old man's confidence was justified or if they were about to witness the expensive destruction of precision German engineering by outdated American stubbornness. The bolt turned with the smooth resistance of properly torqued hardware, and Walter's movements remained steady and sure. Whatever doubts he might have harbored were invisible to the watching eyes, hidden behind the kind of professional calm that comes from 5 decades of making decisions under pressure. As the first bolt came free, a small amount of hydraulic fluid leaked from the loosened connection, not the clean, amber-colored oil that should have been circulating through the system, but fluid contaminated with tiny metallic particles that glittered in the fluorescent light like industrial snow. Powell stepped closer, her expression shifting from skepticism toward something approaching professional interest. "Is that supposed to be in there?" Walter held up the bolt, its threads coated with the contaminated fluid. "No, ma'am. It's not." The contaminated hydraulic fluid clung to Walter's fingers like liquid evidence, its metallic sheen catching the harsh fluorescent lights as he held his hand up for the growing crowd to see. The tiny particles suspended in the amber liquid told a story that the plant's sophisticated diagnostic computers had missed entirely, a narrative written in the microscopic language of mechanical failure that only experience could translate. Powell leaned closer, her engineer's training warring with 3 years of embracing digital solutions over hands-on investigation. "What kind of contamination are we looking at?" Walter wiped his fingers on a shop rag that had seen cleaner days, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the mounting pressure from Morrison's increasingly frequent glances at his watch. "Bearing material," he said, rolling a few of the metallic particles between his thumb and forefinger. "Bronze, looks like. Maybe some steel shavings mixed in." Lisa Chun pulled out her tablet, fingers flying across the touchscreen as she accessed the machine's maintenance history. "That's impossible," she said, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone whose world was built on data and specifications. "The bearing assemblies were inspected and certified just 6 months ago. The German technicians signed off on everything, ma'am," Walter said gently. "Sometimes parts fail between inspections. Sometimes they fail because of the inspections." The comment hung in the air like smoke from a welding torch, acrid and lingering. Around them, the morning shift workers had begun to form loose clusters of spectators, their conversations dropping to whispers as word spread that something significant might be developing. The entertainment value of watching the old-timer embarrass himself was giving way to genuine curiosity about what he might actually find. Morrison's phone buzzed again and his face went pale as he read the incoming message. "Corporate's sending a team down from Detroit," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "They want a full report on why a $2 million machine is down for more than 4 hours. Walter continued working, removing additional bolts with the methodical patience of someone who understood that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes in precision machinery led to catastrophic failures. Each component he exposed revealed more evidence of the same metallic contamination, a progressive failure that had been building for weeks or possibly months, while the digital diagnostic systems reported normal operation. Tommy Castellano, despite his earlier skepticism, found himself drawn closer to watch Walter's methodical disassembly. His tattooed arms crossed over his chest, but his expression had shifted from derision to genuine interest. "How'd you know to look there?" he asked, gesturing toward the manifold assembly that Walter was carefully exposing. "The sound," Walter replied, selecting a smaller wrench from his time-worn collection. "When you've listened to machines long enough, you learn they've got their own language. This one was trying to tell us something was wrong, but we weren't listening." Dr. James Rutherford, the plant's quality control manager, approached with the measured stride of someone whose PhD in industrial engineering had never quite prepared him for the reality of production floors. His clipboard held checklists and procedures, neat columns of checkboxes that represented the orderly world he preferred to inhabit. At 45, he'd spent more time in conference rooms than on factory floors. But his position demanded that he appear knowledgeable about the mechanical processes that drove the plant's success. Kowalski, Rutherford said, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone who wasn't quite sure how to address a former employee. I have to express concern about unauthorized disassembly of warranty-covered equipment. Our service agreement with the manufacturer specifically prohibits. Walter's pale blue eyes met Rutherford's without hostility, but with the kind of steady regard that made younger men realize they were being measured against decades of real-world experience. Dr. Rutherford, he said quietly, sometimes you have to choose between following procedures and solving problems. As Walter removed the final access panel, the source of the contamination became visible to everyone gathered around the machine. A bearing race, designed to last for years under normal operating conditions, had developed hairline fractures that allowed bronze material to flake off into the hydraulic system. The failed component was invisible to computer diagnostics because it was still technically functional. The machine could build pressure, the bearing still turned, all the digital sensors reported normal operation. But the microscopic debris generated by the failing bearing had been circulating through the hydraulic system like metallic blood poisoning, gradually clogging filters and creating the intermittent pressure drops that had finally brought the entire assembly to a halt. Powell stared at the damaged bearing, her expression shifting through surprise, professional admiration, and something that might have been embarrassment. The diagnostic system should have caught this, she said, more to herself than to anyone else. The diagnostic system did what it was designed to do, Walter replied, his tone carrying no judgment, only the patient explanation of a teacher addressing a promising student. It monitored all the parameters it was programmed to watch. But some problems happen in the spaces between the parameters. Chun was already on her tablet, pulling up supplier information and warranty details. This is a manufacturing defect, she said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who'd found a problem that wasn't her fault. The bearing race shows clear signs of improper metallurgy. We can file a claim with the German manufacturer. Morrison stepped forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the concrete floor as he surveyed the exposed mechanical components. The plant manager's expression was difficult to read, relief at finding the problem warred with, irritation that his state-of-the-art diagnostic systems had been shown up by a retired mechanic with old tools and older methods. How long to replace the bearing? Morrison asked, addressing the question to Powell but keeping his eyes on Walter. Powell consulted her tablet, scrolling through parts catalogs and supplier databases. If we can get it shipped overnight from the manufacturer's warehouse in Ohio, maybe 36 hours. Installation time, system testing, recalibration, single quotes, 3 days minimum, Walter said quietly. Maybe 4. If you follow all the warranty procedures. The weight of that timeline settled over the group like industrial dust, coating everything with the grit of expensive reality. 3 or 4 days of downtime would cost the company nearly $1 million in lost production. Overtime wages to make up the backlog, and penalty clauses for missed delivery deadlines. Walter reached into his toolbox again, this time retrieving a small electronic device that looked like it had been assembled from spare parts in someone's garage. The instrument's case was held together with electrical tape, and its analog gauges had the yellowed faces of equipment that had seen decades of service. Compared to the sleek digital instruments hanging from the plant's modern service carts, Walter's device looked like something that belonged in a museum of industrial history. What is that thing? Chun asked, her voice mixing curiosity with professional skepticism. Bearing frequency analyzer, Walter replied, connecting leads to various points on the damaged assembly. Built it myself about 20 years ago when the factory wouldn't spring for commercial equipment. The device hummed to life, its analog needles dancing across graduated scales as Walter moved the sensor probe along the bearing housing. The readings it displayed meant nothing to most of the watching crowd, but Powell found herself leaning closer, trying to interpret the patterns that Walter seemed to read as easily as a newspaper. There's your smoking gun, Walter said, tapping the gauge with one weathered finger. Harmonic frequency shows the race failed about 3 weeks ago. Been getting progressively worse since then. Morrison's face darkened as the implications sank in. 3 weeks of gradually increasing damage, 3 weeks of warning signs that their $1 million diagnostic system had completely missed. 3 weeks during which a simple bearing replacement could have prevented the complete system shutdown they now faced. So what are our options? Morrison asked, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who already knew the answer wouldn't be what he wanted to hear. Walter looked up from his improvised analyzer, and for the first time since entering the plant, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his weathered face. Well, he said, that depends on whether you want to do this the new way or the old way. The silence that followed Walter's question stretched across the production floor like the moment before a storm breaks, heavy with possibility and fraught with the kind of tension that comes when established order meets unexpected challenge. Morrison's jaw worked silently as he processed the implications of Walter's words. While around them, the morning shift workers found excuses to drift closer, their conversations dropping to whispers as they sensed something significant was about to unfold. Walter straightened slowly, his movements carrying the deliberate care of someone whose joints had earned their stiffness through decades of crawling under machinery and wrestling with stubborn components. He wiped his hands on the shop rag again, taking his time as he studied the faces gathered around the disabled machine. "The new way," Walter began, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone who had explained complex concepts to countless apprentices over the years, "means following the book. Call the manufacturer in Germany. Wait for their technicians to fly over with their computers and their certification paperwork. Order the exact replacement part through official channels, document everything in triplicate, and make sure every step gets approved by quality control." He gestured toward the exposed bearing assembly, where the damaged race gleamed with metallic contamination like a wound that had been festering in darkness. "That's the safe way, the warranty-approved way. The way that covers everyone's reputation if something goes wrong." Powell found herself nodding along, recognizing the institutional caution that had governed her own rise through the company hierarchy. Every decision had to be defensible, every action had to follow established procedures, every risk had to be minimized through layers of documentation and approval processes. But Walter continued, his pale blue eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd like a professor surveying his classroom. "The new way also means 3 or 4 days of downtime while the lawyers and the bureaucrats and the certified technicians make sure every I gets totted and every T gets crossed." Morrison's expensive watch caught the fluorescent light as he checked the time again, a nervous habit that had become more pronounced as the morning wore on. "And the old way?" Walter reached into his toolbox, this time retrieving a small wooden box that looked like it had been handcrafted in someone's garage workshop. The lid was held closed by simple brass hinges that had been polished smooth by countless openings. And when Walter lifted it, the interior revealed a collection of bearings, races, and seals arranged with the same obsessive precision that characterized all of his tools. "The old way," Walter said, selecting a bearing race from the collection, "means understanding that machinery follows the same basic principles whether it was built in Germany last year or Detroit 50 years ago. Metal fatigue is metal fatigue. Hydraulic pressure is hydraulic pressure. Physics doesn't change just because the computer controlling it gets more sophisticated." He held up the replacement part, its surface gleaming with the fresh machining marks of recent manufacture. "This bearing race came out of a 1987 stamping press that got scrapped last month. Different machine, different manufacturer, but the specs are identical to what's failing in your German engineering marvel." Lisa Chun stepped forward, her tablet forgotten as she examined the bearing race in Walter's weathered hands. Her engineering training warred with 3 years of corporate conditioning that emphasized brand loyalty and warranty compliance over practical problem-solving. "The dimensional tolerances might be different," she said, her voice carrying the cautious tone of someone who was genuinely curious but professionally obligated to express doubt. "The metallurgy could be incompatible. The load ratings might not match." Walter's expression softened into something approaching paternal approval, as if Chun had asked exactly the right question. "Ma'am, that's good thinking. Those are exactly the concerns an engineer should have." He set the bearing on the workbench where the fluorescent lights illuminated every surface detail. "Let me show you how we can verify compatibility without waiting for a German technician to fly across the ocean." What followed was a masterclass in practical engineering that no university had ever offered and no textbook had ever documented. Walter pulled out measuring instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum, but which proved to be calibrated to tolerances that shamed their modern digital equivalents. He measured bore diameters, race widths, and load capacities with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the difference between success and catastrophic failure often came down to measurements that were invisible to the naked eye. "See here," Walter said, inviting Chun to look through an optical comparator that had been manufactured when her parents were still in elementary school. "The bearing race profile matches within 0.02 of an inch. The load rating's actually 20% higher than the original specification." Tommy Castellano, who had been maintaining a respectful distance despite his growing fascination with Walter's process, finally stepped closer. "How do you know all this stuff? I mean, where did you learn to measure parts like that?" Walter's weathered face creased into what might have been a smile as he looked at the younger man. "Tommy, right?" When Castellano nodded, Walter continued. Back when I started in this business, we didn't have computers to tell us what was wrong with a machine. We had to learn to listen, to feel, to understand what the machinery was trying to tell us. He gestured toward the disabled assembly unit, its silent mass dominating the production floor like a sleeping giant. That machine cost $2 million and came with diagnostic systems that can monitor 300 different parameters in real time. But all that technology missed something that a 10-cent bearing race failure could have predicted weeks ago. Dr. Rutherford, who had been observing from what he considered a safe professional distance, finally spoke up. Emmer Kowalski. I appreciate the historical perspective, but modern manufacturing operates under quality control standards that weren't available in previous decades. The liability issues alone, Dr. Rutherford, Walter interrupted gently, his voice carrying the patient firmness of someone who had dealt with nervous administrators for most of his career. Let me ask you something. What's the liability if we lose $1 million contract because we couldn't deliver on time? The question hung in the air like welding smoke, acrid and uncomfortable. Rutherford's clipboard suddenly seemed inadequate as a shield against the economic reality that Walter's words had illuminated, his voice carrying clearly across the production floor. We can spend 3 days following procedures that protect everyone's job security. Or we can spend 3 hours solving a problem that's been hiding in plain sight. Powell found herself studying Walter's face, trying to read the confidence that seemed to radiate from his weathered features like heat from a forge. 3 hours? Yenja mi You're saying you can have this machine run in 3 hours? Walter's pale blue eyes met hers with the steady regard of someone who had made similar promises countless times over 5 decades, and had kept them more often than not. Ma'am, I'm saying I can have this machine running better than it was before it broke down. Morrison's phone buzzed again, but for the first time that morning he ignored it. Something in Walter's voice had caught his attention. A certainty that transcended the bureaucratic caution that normally governed plant operations. What do you need? Morrison asked. And the simple question carried the weight of a decision that would either salvage his career or destroy it entirely. Walter looked around at the faces surrounding him, young and old, skeptical and hopeful, all united by their dependence on the silent machine that represented their livelihood and their future. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away from his shoulders, and something that had been dormant for 3 years of forced retirement stirred back to life. I need 3 hours, Walter said quietly, and I need everyone to remember that sometimes the old ways work because they've been tested by time instead of committees. Walter's weathered hands moved over the disabled machine with the reverence of a concert pianist, approaching a grand piano. Each touch deliberate and informed by decades of understanding the language that metal spoke when it was stressed, worn, or pushed beyond its intended limits. The morning sunlight had shifted through the factory's high windows, casting longer shadows across the production floor as the first hour of his self-imposed 3-hour deadline slipped away like oil through a cracked gasket. The crowd of observers had grown larger, drawn by the magnetic pull of watching someone work with absolute confidence in an environment where uncertainty had become the dominant emotion. Word had spread through the plant's informal communication network faster than any official announcement could have traveled, bringing workers from other departments who found excuses to drift past the disabled assembly unit during their breaks. First thing we do, Walter said, his voice carrying the patient cadence of someone who had trained countless apprentices over the decades, is understand what this machine was trying to tell us before it gave up entirely. He positioned his homemade frequency analyzer against the bearing housing again, its analog gauges dancing as he moved the sensor probe with the precision of a medical examination. Janet Powell found herself leaning closer, her engineer's training awakening to possibilities she hadn't considered in years of relying on computerized diagnostics. What exactly are you measuring with that thing? Walter's pale blue eyes brightened with the enthusiasm of a teacher whose student had asked precisely the right question. Every bearing has a signature frequency when it's healthy, he explained, adjusting the analyzer's controls with movements that spoke of countless repetitions. When it starts to fail, that signature changes in predictable ways. This little device can hear those changes weeks before they become visible to the naked eye. Lisa Chun approached with her tablet, her earlier skepticism giving way to professional curiosity. The manufacturer's diagnostic system monitors vibration patterns continuously. How could your analog device detect something that escaped digital analysis? Ma'am, Walter replied, his tone carrying respect for the question rather than dismissal of the questioner. Your computer system is programmed to look for vibration patterns that fall outside normal operating parameters. But sometimes the most dangerous failures happen gradually, staying just inside the boundaries of what the computer considers normal. He gestured toward the contaminated hydraulic fluid that had been draining into a collection pan, its metallic particles catching the light like industrial snow. This bearing race has been failing for weeks, maybe months, but so slowly that the vibration increase never triggered an alarm. The computer saw it as normal wear instead of impending catastrophe. Tommy Castellano's initial skepticism had evolved into grudging respect, stepped closer to examine Walter's collection of improvised instruments. Where'd you learn to build stuff like this? I mean, they don't teach this in tech school. Walter's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile as he selected another tool from his time-worn collection. Tommy, back when I started in this business, we couldn't afford to buy specialized equipment for every diagnostic task. If you needed something that didn't exist, you learned to build it yourself. What followed was a demonstration of mechanical intuition that transcended formal training or institutional knowledge. Walter's hands seemed to know exactly how much pressure to apply to each bolt, precisely which angle would allow stubborn components to separate without damage, and instinctively where to place his improvised tools for maximum effectiveness. Dr. Rutherford watched from what he considered a safe professional distance. His clipboard clutched like a shield against the liability implications of unauthorized repair procedures. "M.R. Kowalski," he called out, his voice carrying the careful formality of someone trying to establish official distance from what might become a costly mistake. "I feel obligated to document that these procedures are being performed without manufacturer approval." Walter paused in his work, looking up at the quality control manager with the patient regard of someone who had dealt with nervous administrators throughout his career. "Dr. Rutherford, I appreciate your position, and I respect your need to follow procedures." He gestured toward the silent machine that dominated the production floor like a sleeping giant. "But right now, we have a choice between following procedures and solving problems." The damaged bearing race came free with a soft metallic whisper, its surface showing the telltale patterns of progressive failure that Walter's experienced eyes could read like text on a page. He held it up for the assembled crowd to see, rotating it slowly so the fluorescent lights illuminated every crack and stress point. "See these fracture patterns?" Walter asked, his voice taking on the instructional tone of someone who had explained complex mechanical concepts to countless apprentices over the decades. "They tell a story about how this failure developed. Started here at this stress concentration point, probably caused by a momentary overload during installation 18 months ago." Powell leaned closer, her engineering background allowing her to appreciate the forensic analysis that Walter was conducting with nothing more than visual inspection and decades of experience. "How can you tell all that just by looking at it?" "Man, when you've seen enough failures, they start to follow predictable patterns," Walter replied, his fingers tracing the crack lines with the gentleness of someone handling archaeological artifacts. "This particular failure signature usually indicates improper installation torque combined with excessive thermal cycling." Lisa Chun looked up from her tablet, where she had been cross-referencing Walter's observations with the machine's installation records. The installation logs show all torque specifications were followed exactly according to the manufacturer's procedures. Walter's expression softened into something approaching paternal understanding. "Miss Chun, sometimes the manufacturer's procedures are written by people who understand the theory perfectly but have never felt how a bearing responds to different installation techniques." He reached into his toolbox again, this time retrieving a torque wrench that looked like it had been manufactured during the Eisenhower administration. Its chrome plating was worn through to bare metal in the places where countless hands had gripped it. But when Walter checked its calibration against a modern digital instrument, the readings matched to within 0.5%. "This wrench has installed more bearings than your computer system has ever analyzed," Walter said quietly, his voice carrying a reverence that bordered on the spiritual. "It knows the difference between specification compliance and installation excellence." The replacement bearing race slipped into place with the satisfying precision of properly matched components, its machined surfaces mating with the existing hardware as if they had been designed specifically for each other. Walter's movements remained steady and sure, guided by muscle memory that had been developed over decades of similar repairs. Morrison, who had been monitoring the corporate text messages with increasing frequency, finally looked up from his phone to observe Walter's progress. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice carrying the tension of someone whose career hung in the balance of the next few hours. Walter glanced at his own watch, a simple analog timepiece that had survived decades of industrial abuse without losing accuracy. About 90 minutes for the mechanical work, he said, his tone suggesting confidence rather than hope. Then we'll need time to test the system and bring it back online gradually. Gradually? Powell asked, her engineering background making her curious about Walter's methodical approach to system restoration. Ma'am, this machine has been down for several hours, and its hydraulic system has been contaminated with bearing debris, Walter explained, his hands continuing their work as he spoke. If we bring it back to full operation too quickly, any remaining contamination could damage other components. He gestured toward the hydraulic reservoir, where clean fluid was slowly replacing the contaminated oil that had been circulating through the system. We need to flush the entire hydraulic circuit, test all the pressure relief valves, and verify that the filtration system can handle any residual particles. The systematic approach that Walter outlined impressed the watching technicians, whose formal training had emphasized the importance of gradual system restoration but had never provided the practical experience necessary to implement it effectively. Here was someone whose decades of hands-on work had taught him not just how to fix problems, but how to prevent new problems from developing during the repair process. As Walter continued his methodical restoration of the bearing assembly, something had changed in the atmosphere surrounding the disabled machine. The initial skepticism and amusement had given way to professional respect, and the casual conversations had been replaced by focused attention to the techniques being demonstrated. For the first time in 3 years of forced retirement, Walter Kowalski was doing what he had been born to do, and the machine was beginning to respond to his touch like an instrument in the hands of a master musician. The second hour of Walter's self-imposed deadline had passed like smoke through the factory's ventilation system, invisible but measurable by those who understood the rhythms of industrial time. The hydraulic reservoir now gleamed with clean fluid, its amber transparency a stark contrast to the contaminated oil that had been slowly poisoning the system for weeks. Walter's methodical approach to the restoration had transformed what could have been a rushed emergency repair into something approaching mechanical artistry. The crowd of observers had evolved from casual spectators to engaged participants, their questions becoming more sophisticated as Walter's patient explanations revealed layers of mechanical knowledge that formal training had never provided. Even Lisa Chun found herself setting aside her tablet in favor of direct observation, her engineer's mind recognizing that she was witnessing techniques that couldn't be learned from textbooks or computer simulations. Now comes the critical part, Walter announced, his weathered hands positioning the final components with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a timepiece. Everything we've done up to this point has been preparation. The real test is whether this machine remembers how to be healthy. Tommy Castellano, whose initial skepticism had transformed into genuine fascination, leaned closer to observe Walter's technique. What do you mean? Remembers how to be healthy? Walter's pale blue eyes met the younger man's with the patient regard of someone who had spent decades translating complex mechanical concepts into language that practical workers could understand. Tommy, machines are like people in some ways. When they've been sick for a while, they forget what normal operation feels like. You can't just flip a switch and expect everything to work perfectly. He gestured toward the control panel, where status lights remained dark except for the persistent red fault, indicator that had been blinking since the morning's catastrophic shutdown. We need to bring this system back to life gradually, one component at a time, giving each part a chance to adjust to proper operation before we ask it to handle full production loads. Janet Powell found herself nodding in recognition of principles she had learned in engineering school but had rarely seen implemented in practice. Controlled startup procedures, she said, more to herself than to the watching crowd. The textbooks emphasize it, but most technicians skip those steps to save time. Ma'am, that's exactly right, Walter replied, his tone carrying the approval of a teacher whose student had grasped an important concept. Time saved during startup is usually paid back with interest when systems fail under full load. Dr. Rutherford, who had been maintaining his careful professional distance throughout the repair process, finally approached the group surrounding the machine. His clipboard remained clutched in one hand, but his expression had shifted from bureaucratic caution toward something approaching curiosity. Miss Kowalski, Rutherford said, his voice carrying less formality than it had earlier in the morning. Assuming this repair is successful, how do we prevent similar failures in the future? Our preventive maintenance program follows manufacturer recommendations exactly. Walter straightened slowly, his movements carrying the deliberate care of someone whose joints had earned their stiffness through decades of crawling under machinery and wrestling with stubborn components. Dr. Rutherford, that's the most important question anyone's asked all morning. He walked to the machine's main control panel, his finger tracing the array of touchscreens and indicator lights that represented millions of dollars in diagnostic sophistication. Your preventive maintenance program monitors everything the manufacturers tell you to monitor. But sometimes the most critical warning signs happen in the spaces between the official monitoring points. Walter pulled out his homemade frequency analyzer again, its analog gauges and hand-soldered connections, looking primitive compared to the sleek digital instruments that surrounded it. This little device cost me about $40 in parts and maybe 6 hours of assembly time, but it can detect bearing problems weeks before they become visible to your $1 million diagnostic system. Lisa Chun stepped forward, her professional curiosity overriding her earlier skepticism. Why haven't the manufacturers incorporated that capability into their standard diagnostic systems? The question hung in the air like welding smoke, uncomfortable and illuminating at the same time. Walter's weathered face creased into something that might have been a smile, but carried undertones of sadness that spoke to decades of watching practical solutions give way to profitable complications. Miss Chun, Walter said gently, sometimes the answer to that question isn't technical. Sometimes it's economic. Morrison, who had been monitoring the increasingly urgent text messages from corporate headquarters, looked up from his phone with an expression that mixed hope with desperation. Walter, how much longer before we can test the system? Walter glanced at his analog watch, its simple face showing the passage of time with the steady reliability of mechanical movement that had outlasted 3 generations of digital timepieces. About 20 minutes for the final connections, then we can begin the startup sequence. The startup sequence that Walter described wasn't the simple switch-throwing procedure that most of the watching technicians expected. Instead, it was a carefully orchestrated process of bringing individual components online in a specific order, testing each subsystem's response before proceeding to the next level of complexity. First, we start the hydraulic pump at minimum speed, Walter explained, his hands moving across controls with the confidence of someone who had performed similar procedures countless times. We're not trying to build full system pressure yet. We just want to circulate clean fluid through the lines and verify that there are no leaks or restrictions. The pump motor hummed to life with a sound that was noticeably different from the labored operation that had characterized the morning's failed startup attempts. The hydraulic fluid began circulating through transparent sight gauges, its clean amber flow visible to everyone gathered around the machine. Listen to that, Walter said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose diagnosis had been confirmed by results. Hear how smooth the pump sounds now. That's what it should have sounded like all along. Powell found herself concentrating on the subtle audio differences that Walter highlighted, her engineering background allowing her to appreciate the diagnostic information contained in mechanical sounds. The pump cavitation is completely gone, she observed, her voice carrying a note of professional admiration. Ma'am, that's exactly right, Walter replied, his tone showing approval for Powell's growing understanding of the principles he was demonstrating. Cavitation was a symptom of the bearing contamination. Clean fluid flows smoothly through the system instead of carrying debris that creates turbulence. As the system pressure gradually increased under Walter's careful control, something remarkable began happening among the watching crowd. The casual conversations and skeptical comments had been replaced by focused attention to the techniques being demonstrated. Workers who had dismissed Walter as an outdated relic were now asking questions about his methods, genuinely curious about principles they had never encountered in their formal training. Tommy Castellano, whose tattoos and motorcycle lifestyle had initially marked him as someone unlikely to appreciate old-fashioned craftsmanship, found himself studying Walter's every movement with the intensity of an apprentice learning from a master. How do you know when to increase the pressure to the next level? Tommy asked, his earlier dismissiveness completely absent from his tone. Walter's weathered hands remained steady on the controls as he monitored multiple gauges simultaneously, his eyes moving between analog instruments and digital displays with the fluid attention of someone who understood that complete system knowledge required information from multiple sources. Tommy, it's a combination of things, Walter replied, his voice taking on the instructional tone he had used with countless apprentices over the decades. You watch the pressure gauges, but you also listen to the pump, feel the vibration in the machine frame, and pay attention to how the hydraulic fluid looks as it circulates through the sight glasses. The systematic approach that Walter demonstrated revealed layers of mechanical understanding that formal training programs had never provided. Here was someone whose decades of hands-on experience had taught him not just how to operate machinery, but how to understand its needs, anticipate its problems, and restore its health when conventional methods failed. As the third hour of his self-imposed deadline approached, Walter's confidence remained steady, but something in his expression suggested that the most critical test was still ahead. The machine was responding beautifully to his careful restoration, but true success would only be measured when it returned to full production operation under the demanding conditions that had originally caused its failure. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone present understood that the next few minutes would determine whether Walter's old-fashioned methods could deliver on their promise, or whether 3 years of technological advancement had indeed rendered his approach obsolete. The third hour approached like gathering storm clouds, heavy with expectation and fraught with tension. Careers, reputations, and livelihoods hung in the balance of mechanical precision. The assembly unit stood ready for its ultimate test, newly restored components gleaming under harsh fluorescent lights. Morrison had finally turned off his phone, infected by Walter's methodical confidence that felt both dangerous and necessary. Trusting a retired mechanic over manufacturer protocols represented either inspired leadership or career suicide. Wouldn't know which until the machine either roared to life or suffered catastrophic failure. "This is where theory meets reality," Walter said quietly. Weathered hands moving across the control panel with conductor-like reverence. "Everything we've done has been preparation. Now the machine proves it can handle actual production demands." The crowd had grown to include representatives from every department, faces reflecting hope and anxiety. Word had spread through informal networks that something unprecedented was happening, either triumph of experience over caution, or spectacular demonstration of why modern procedures existed. Powell held her breath as Walter's finger hovered over full system operation controls. Her engineering background appreciated the complexity of his accomplishment, but also understood catastrophic consequences of hydraulic failure under full pressure. "Hydraulic system at full pressure," Walter announced, monitoring multiple gauges simultaneously. "Relief valves responding normally. Filtration functioning within specifications, bearing temperatures stable." Chun looked up from documenting procedures on her tablet. "Vibration analysis shows bearing frequency signature within normal parameters," she reported. Skepticism completely replaced by professional admiration. Rutherford stepped closer, clipboard forgotten. "What happens if the system fails under full load?" Walter's pale blue eyes met his without evasion. "Dr. Rutherford, if I've made diagnostic mistakes, this machine could suffer damage, making this morning's problem look trivial." He gestured toward the massive unit. "But if I'm right, this machine will run better than since installation day." Tommy voiced everyone's unspoken question. "Percentage-wise, what are the odds this works?" Walter considered seriously. "Machinery never provides certainty, but this bearing assembly is healthier than when first installed. And the hydraulic system is cleaner than in months." His hand moved to the final control. "Sometimes you trust that experience and preparation are worth more than warranties and guarantees." The moment stretched like hot metal under stress. Walter's finger touched the switch, and the production floor held its collective breath. The machine responded with deep mechanical sigh growing into steady thrumming rhythm, restored components engaging with clockwork precision. The sound was noticeably different from morning's labored attempts, cleaner, steadier, more confident. "Listen to that," Powell whispered, detecting healthy mechanical operation signatures. "The harmonic frequencies are completely different." Walter nodded, showing satisfaction rather than surprise as he monitored complex gauges telling the story of returned health. "That's components working in harmony instead of fighting contamination and misalignment." The conveyor system engaged with a whisper of perfectly lubricated bearings, movement so smooth it seemed to float. Production fixtures began their choreographed dance, each component moving with fluid grace of peak efficiency. "How long before full production?" Morrison asked, anxiety shifting toward amazement as fault displays showed normal operation. Walter consulted his analog watch. 15 minutes of light operation to verify system stability under load, then gradually increased to normal output levels. What followed was systematic verification, no training program provided. Walter guided increasingly demanding tests, each stage stressing different components and verifying that restoration eliminated both immediate problems and underlying causes. The crowd witnessed something unexpected. RETIRED mechanic demonstrating techniques more thorough than manufacturer startup procedures. Every test revealed another layer of Walter's mechanical understanding, every verification adding credibility to dismissed methods. Chun announced from her tablet, "Operational parameters are better than baseline. Bearing temperatures lower, vibration reduced. Hydraulic pressure stability significantly improved." The implications rippled through watchers like shock waves. Walter's methods hadn't just repaired catastrophic failure, they'd improved performance beyond original specifications. "How is that possible?" Rutherford asked with genuine curiosity. Walter's hands remained steady on controls, monitoring machine response to increasing demands. Sometimes fixing one problem reveals opportunities to solve problems you didn't know existed. As the machine approached full production speed, its mechanical voice settled into healthy operation rhythm, each component contributing to precision symphony missing since installation. The sound declared that old knowledge and new technology could work together with earned wisdom. Walter stepped back from controls, pale blue eyes surveying the machine that had challenged every assumption about obsolescence. For the first time in 3 retirement years, he looked like someone who remembered who he was supposed to be. The ultimate test was complete, but morning's real lessons were just beginning. The steady rhythm of the restored assembly unit filled Riverside Manufacturing with the sound of perfect mechanical harmony. 3 hours after Walter Kowalski had walked through the employee entrance carrying his battered red toolbox, the impossible had become reality, and catastrophic failure had transformed into unexpected triumph. Morrison stood before the machine's status display, watching green indicators tell the story of peak efficiency. His expensive suit remained disheveled from the morning's stress, but his expression showed profound transformation, relief mixed with the humility that comes when fundamental assumptions prove wrong. Final production test completed successfully, Powell announced, her voice carrying professional satisfaction. All systems optimal, output quality exceeds specification. Efficiency metrics running 15% above baseline. The numbers represented more than technical success. Walter's methodical approach had not only solved the immediate problem, but optimized performance beyond the manufacturer's original expectations. Walter stood quietly beside his toolbox, weathered hands wipe and clean his instruments with practiced care. Each tool returned to its designated place in the collection that had served him faithfully for 5 decades. Lisa Chun approached with her tablet, professional humility replacing earlier skepticism. Mr. Kowalski, would you document your diagnostic procedures? These techniques aren't in our standard training programs. Walter's pale blue eyes met hers with patient regard. Miss Chun, I'd be happy to share what I know, but understand that some techniques take years to develop. It's about learning to listen to what machinery is trying to tell you. Tommy Castellano stepped forward, respect replacing his morning dismissiveness. Walter, I owe you an apology. I thought you were just some old guy who didn't understand modern equipment. Walter's face creased into something approaching a smile, carrying no trace of vindication. Tommy, you thought what most people think when they see someone my age in a world that changes this fast. The mistake wasn't your thinking, it was our failing to show that experience still has value alongside innovation. Morrison stepped away from the status display. Genuine leadership emerging from crisis. Walter, I want to ask you something important. Would you consider coming back? Not as a contractor, but as someone who could bridge the gap between sophisticated technology and the practical knowledge that prevented disaster today. The offer shimmered with possibility, representing more than employment. It was recognition that experience and innovation could work together when mutual respect replaced institutional prejudice. Walter's hands closed his toolbox lid with the soft click of brass hinges worn smooth by decades of service. Rick, I appreciate the offer more than you realize. 3 years ago, I thought my useful days were behind me. He looked around at faces both young and old, united by witnessing something transcendent. This morning reminded me that knowledge doesn't become obsolete just because it gets older. Sometimes it needs the right opportunity to prove its value. Walter's voice carried quiet satisfaction of rediscovered purpose. I'd be honored to come back, but on one condition. I want to work with people like Miss Chun and Tommy, combining old ways with new ways, ensuring we don't lose practical wisdom while embracing technological advances. The agreement represented more than hiring. It symbolized recognition that wisdom comes in many forms, and effective solutions emerge when different generations work together rather than compete. As the afternoon shift arrived, they found a production floor humming with efficiency and possibility. Morning crisis had transformed into learning opportunity, and the machine that threatened careers had become catalyst for new understanding of what teamwork could accomplish across age, education, and institutional barriers. Walter walked toward the employee entrance carrying the same battered toolbox, but his step carried spring, absent for 3 years of retirement. Behind him, the restored assembly unit maintained steady rhythm, mechanical testament to enduring value of experience, patience, and wisdom earned through lifetime dedication. The last turn had become a new beginning, and the echo of worth would resonate through Riverside Manufacturing for generations. If Walter's redemption touched your heart, if it reminded you that every person carries hidden depths of wisdom, then help others discover this message. Like the steady rhythm of his restored machine, Stories of human dignity gain power when shared. Subscribe to keep these tales alive. Comment about someone in your life who deserves recognition for quiet wisdom. And share this story with anyone needing reminder that true value isn't always visible. The most extraordinary gifts often come in ordinary packages, and the most important lessons are taught by those who've earned knowledge through decades of overlooked dedication.